it's on my head. Find the cure to cure myself.
Yes, it is. It's time once again for Critical Mass TV, the Black Rose Edition. Brought to you by Black Rose Burlington. Clearly, the only Burlington anarchist group that has its own damn TV show. It seems like Sunday, September 14th, 2014, so I'm sure it is. All views and opinions on tonight's episode are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Vermont Community Access Media, even though they should be. Critical mass is the smallest number of people required to sustain meaningful change in the world. So get on the bus. How about some mixed mental arts for all of our intellectual self-defense? The chill in the late summer air this morning did nothing to curtail the hundreds of participants and spectators at the Pride Vermont parade that wound its way from Lower Church Street through the marketplace to a festival-like atmosphere at Battery Park. Black Rose Burlington was an official participant, one of several political philosophies represented running the gamut from mainstream Democrats to the Vermont Libertarian Party. The one obvious exception being any Republicans at all. Obviously, you know, their party platform itself has many homophobic planks, and the party never seems to have a problem with using bigotry as a wedge issue, so it's not surprising there wasn't an official delegation. Knowing that there are truly no single issues under the sun, and that liberation and justice must truly be for all if we are to survive, tonight we try for a little context. We justifiably celebrate the growth of queer liberation internationally with its successes and gains. But we must remember that there are huge areas of the world where things are getting worse, with some African countries and capitalist Russia passing aggressive anti-gay laws even very recently. In the U.S., we still have many homophobic anti-gay marriage laws, but also some notable strikings down of such laws by the judiciary. Obviously, much work here at home still needs to be done. So, all right, I'm joined tonight by friend and associate Emily Reynolds, of Black Rose Burlington. She and I will have some lively discussion, I'm sure, but first we have a couple of videos to get us going. The first video was made by Brianna Murphy and Claire Martin last year. They were both aged 14 when they made this little documentary. They ventured to Church Street to capture the annual Pride Vermont parade on September 24th, 2013. So, Jim, if you could start us on that first video.
Here once again, and how many years we've been celebrating our pride in Vermont as opposed to fighting for our pride in Vermont. But we know that's not the case everywhere else in the world. We have Russia to think about, and places in our own country. And so while we're celebrating, let's think of our brothers and sisters all over the world who don't have it as lucky.
In state after state, the legislature wants to regulate human nature. In short, from sea to shining sea, they want to tell you who to be. They can pass all the statutes.
I don't know how many parents of gay kids are ecstatic when they come out to them. I was. The greatest thrill for me is to walk hand in hand with my daughter. What a thrill. When she came out to me, I was ecstatic. I already do.
All the statutes that they please. Acorns won't grow into maple trees. Besides those differences they hate are the strength that makes this country great.
And this year in particular, it's the only Pride event that I've been able to attend because in years past I've traveled to Boston, to New York, and to Montreal. And there was one year once I went all the way to Toronto. It was time for me to stay home this summer.
Yeah.
One thing, it's a lot more down home. It has a much more down home flavor, and aside from the fact that it's also a lot shorter.
Only fools would write those laws. They simply can't succeed because you.
The first parade was in 1983. I think I've missed one. So this is the 30th year. So that means I've done about 29 of them. It changed from a protest march against inequality to a parade of celebration. And most of that happened in 2000. When civil unions was passed. It became more celebratory with some protest in it because we didn't have marriage, we didn't have true equality. But civil unions was a big deal. It was the first recognition of our relationships anywhere in the United States. So that was the tipping point from protest to celebration.
It was really a brave thing to march into back 30 years ago because a lot of people were not out yet and they would get their picture in the paper and come out, or some people couldn't march. So it was a much smaller group, but it was a really, really big spirit, good spirit, because people were really taking a risk. They used to go back and forth between here and Montpelier, coming up Church Street and having people yell and say hello to them. That's a really important part. Just all the color, all the different kinds of people, the drag queens and dykes on bikes and the parents with their kids and the church people. It's all sort of, I like that kind of rainbow community.
My name is Richie Bernash, and I am a sophomore. John Louise and myself took a group of freshmen, members of Common Ground, that were interested in going, so we drove down with them and went and saw the parade. We went and we saw the parade and we didn't march in it. I would like to have seen some Common Ground involvement, maybe next year, even a partnership with Common Ground in Student Global AIDS campaign, because the SGAC community is tied closely to the LGBT community. Really a gathering of so many people, so many different kinds of people that it's really just wonderful to be at and entertaining.
Utah could never be the Beehive State if the hairdressers went absentee. You can't take the homo out of Oklahoma. It's his home and he won't go away. In the land of the free, diversity's the key. You need us to make the USA.
Okay, thank you, Brianna and Claire. I sure hope somebody calls you and tells you that your work was broadcast on TV tonight. And thank you for letting us use that. So the second video is from this year's New York City's annual Pride March, and it is evolving from an act of protest, again, into a celebration of all that the LGBT community has achieved over the years. The outpouring of support for the march transcends all cultural boundaries in the name of love and progress. And those are the words of the creators of this video. So, Jim, if you could roll that second video for us.
It's really, really, really crazy to be here.
It's my first time. I brought my mom. We just out here celebrating, being happy.
It's amazing. I mean, it's the greatest city in the world.
It's the greatest city in the world to be gay. It's phenomenal.
New York really represents for the gay community, and it always has, and there's so much history here.
I guess my favorite thing about the march is the diversity and seeing people from all walks of life coming together in a spirit of unity.
I like everybody's costumes. I like the vibe of everybody. I like the music that's played. I like that everybody's so happy to be with each other.
I think each year it gets a little bit more exciting because gay rights are moving so quickly now, and I think everyone feels it and everyone's really excited.
Bigger venues, bigger people, more acceptance.
There's a less of a political end to it than there used to be. You know, we've gotten a lot of the rights that we've been fighting for, so there's just a little bit more of a celebratory nature.
I mean, it means a lot to me as someone of the community who comes from a generation where we're still fighting, but we don't have to fight as hard as people who, you know, were at Stonewall, 45 years ago.
You know, we have the same rights as everybody else, and that's how it should be. And it's just amazing to be able to be here today and celebrate that.
It's an awesome experience. Everybody should try it at least once.
But it's just a great time. It's just a freedom moment. It really is.
Happy Pride, JQY!
Happy Pride!
All right, so those are two definitely very interesting and well put together videos. We also took a bunch of photos at today's Burlington Pride March, and Emily and I are going to be showing those to you here in just a couple of minutes. There's always two stories playing out in history. There's the one that we usually are addressing on this show has to do with say ruling class elites and the absolute domination by corporations and capitalism of our daily lives. Today we're talking about the parallel story in history that is never ending, and that is the quest by different groups of people throughout history, almost in a never-ending process, different groups of people trying to attain their best or their basic human rights and to be recognized as human beings. And it seems to me that's what a lot of folks are talking about, and why people should be proud of their achievements, in the gay community. Hi, Emily. Nice to have you here.
How are you, Brad?
I'm doing great. So I'm just sort of segueing into a little historical context of the movement. Of course, Stonewall was a big turning point in history, but that certainly was not the beginning of the story of gay people and the their impact on history. And
yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll go over a little bit of the history and why Stonewall was so important and still really celebrated today. So there was a fair amount of gay activism before Stonewall. You had the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis Societies, which the Mattachine Society was predominantly a gay male group, and originally it was formed by a communist,
Harry Hay.
Harry Hay in the 1960s, but pretty quickly, within 3 years, they decided to really take him off and kind of, originally it was very militant tactics and really pushing for gay people to be seen as sort of different in the ways that as Black Rose, we sort of, as a queer woman, I see that identity as connected to resistance, and not just this component of my identity as a sexuality, but also understanding these greater systems. And so Harry Hay, was a communist and
a radical.
Yeah, real radical, and for 3 years really kind of ran Mattachine, but pretty quickly people thought that wasn't really necessarily the best way to get gay rights on the table. They thought a much less confrontational approach was required. So
trying to assimilate into society rather than confronting it.
Yeah, so they kind of thought that people should mostly work on education, and they didn't really support a lot of trans folks. They thought that homosexuals had to be presentable to heterosexual society, and that the struggles over police harassment in the bars, which for most queer communities, or especially poor gay people, was a big issue, the police harassment, and also for a lot of transgender people, the police harassment was really awful, and they wanted to wear what they wanted to wear, but the Mattachine Society really didn't consider these issues particularly important. They were really like side issues, and they were much more like maybe today in the way we would see the Human Rights Coalition. So pretty quickly they kind of like took away that radical component.
It was in the era of McCarthyism too, in the 50s.
Totally.
So, there was just purges in all kinds of institutions of gay people were included in the lists of people that needed to be purged.
Yeah, I mean, gay people were put on the same list as like the anarchists and the communists in those days because the government specifically thought that gay people, because of fear of their sexual identity, would be more likely to speak to the Soviets. Or would be very likely to speak to...
or be blackmailed.
To be blackmailed in the same way that they were under the assumption that like anarchists and communists didn't have particularly strong connections to the government. So yeah, there was a lot of connections to a lot of these movements today. And so some of the first... So those were some of the really first organized groups. But then before the Stonewall, there was the Compton's Cafeteria Riot, which was a really substantial riot in the Tenderloin, which was a very poor neighborhood.
San Francisco?
In San Francisco,
okay.
Yep. And so there was this like cafe where a lot of transgender women, or today they would probably be called transgender women, at the time I think they were called transsexual women, who would come, and they were mostly just hanging out after their shifts, after work, and they faced harassment all the time. There was a saying that like the police would raid the bars about once a month, and just one day, 1966 in San Francisco, people just had it. Like the police came in and they tried to arrest someone who was dressing as a woman, and the
because
police
that was
decided
criminalized, I think.
It was criminalized, and the police, asked for her ID, and she just refused and like tossed the coffee cup out of his hand. And then after she did that, basically the whole cafeteria erupted in riots, and they smashed all the windows and really kicked the police out. And like now today it's considered one of the first acts of resistance against transgender discrimination. And it's really connected, or a lot of people now see that as connected to Stonewall, which happened about 3 years later. So what people really mark, like why Stonewall was important, was this was really at a time of escalated social movements in general. You have the civil rights movement going on, and that from like the 1950s has kind of escalated into the Black Panthers. You have a lot of the anti-war demonstrations that are escalating into riots. You have the women's liberation movement taking off, and
early environmental movement.
Yeah, the environmental movement. So a lot of these movements, there's this kind of hotbed going on, especially in New York City. And so Stonewall kind of became a turning point because in the 50s and 60s, the police were just constantly raiding these bars. Like Stonewall was shut down about once a month. And the Stonewall riot, what a lot of people forget about is the real connection to the mafia. And there was a really deep connection between the mafia and the police. So the mafia were making a lot more money actually like extorting their very wealthy customers, because there were a few like wealthier gays who would come in and they would basically blackmail them. And so the police would generally, like what was very common before Stonewall is the police would alert the bar owners, and the bar owners would tell, some of their customers and clientele.
Because they were paying the cops off too, weren't they?
Yeah, they were paying the cops off, and they would generally let the owners know early. So there was a really pretty deep connection. And so the police would go in, and a lot of times there was a lot of entrapment. Like the U.S. was basically identifying all known homosexuals at the time. Like they kept very detailed records of where they went, who their friends were, in very much the same ways that anarchists in the U.S. are now monitored and surveilled.
Yeah, Hoover's FBI at the time.
Yeah, so the FBI was monitoring these people, and so the police would sometimes walk into the bar pretending to be gay, pretending, to buy somebody a drink, and eventually if they could get the person to like kiss them or do some kind of homosexual act, so they call it, then they would arrest the person. And this happened fairly routinely. But the night at Stonewall was very different. The police did not tip off the bar. There was some rumors that potentially a raid would happen, but that was not a given on that night. And really a lot of people were very shocked because I guess normally they would turn the lights on. They would change the lights whenever they saw the police, so that they would change it from like the dark kind of bar, dancey atmosphere, and then they just turn on the white lights and everybody would know, okay, it's time to stop touching each other. It's time to just kind of chill out. And so if the police come in, like, what's going on? Nothing's going on.
Right.
Which is, I think kind of a genius tactic. But this night, that didn't happen at all because they had not been tipped off. And so a lot of people were very confused and fairly frightened. And a few people did escape out the back. But mostly, they started like IDing people and trying to arrest them. And they let some people go. And like those who, for some reason on this night, people were just not having it. And the people who were not arrested were kind of hanging out at the door, like mocking the police officers, kind of jiving and like whatever. And then at this point, a lot of these people who were at the bar, like this is Greenwich Village, and a lot of people had a long experience of political activism. So by this point, about 150 people have come outside and are like watching this, and like people are kind of jeering at the police, and one of the participants said, like, when did you ever see a fag fight back? Now times are a-changin'. Tuesday night was the last night for bullshit. Predominantly the theme was this shit has got to stop. So somebody starts throwing pennies in the crowd, and then somebody starts throwing bottles, and they're throwing them at the police cars. And at this point, just something happens in the crowd. I don't know if you've ever been in the situation, Brad, when you can just tell.
Me.
Well, I've been in one or two where it just goes from like everything's kind of okay, and then people are just like going crazy. Like what they say is like one of the people who was getting arrested was basically like fighting off all the police by herself, like trying to fight like 4 police officers.
No, it escalates quickly.
Yeah, and she's like yelling at the crowd, like, y'all, like, what are you doing standing there? Like, I'm fighting for these kids. Like, start doing something. And at this point, everybody just starts going crazy, and people are yelling gay power and like singing We Shall Overcome, the civil rights songs, and really just taking over the streets. And just like the police have lost complete control over the situation.
And they had brought in the New York City Tactical Police Force too, which is would be called a SWAT team nowadays.
Yeah.
And they weren't able to do anything except get swarmed.
No, and the streets were really narrow, which makes it easier for like crowds to really control them. And so they did for that night. And like at this point, 500 to 600 people have shown up, and they actually arrest a folk singer, Dave Von Ronk, at the time, was very popular. And he wasn't gay himself, but he was a really big mover and shaker in the anti-war movement. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, anybody who stand against the cops was all right with me, and that's why I stayed in. Every time he turned around, the cops were pulling some outrage or another. So a lot of people were just showing up at this point, like, to start fighting the police, and a lot of the street kids who've had enough and like have always been kicked out of parks, and like just everybody's kind of like ready and really annoyed at this point. So the next 6 nights, the same thing happens. People are rioting for the next 6 nights. And that's why it was really considered like such an important moment, is this was really the first time that a riot had lasted this long, for this intensity, and it was really about people being gay and really fighting back against this police repression, the police raiding the bars frequently. And very quickly, people started new organizations to fight for spaces for people to be openly gay. But yeah, so what was also, I think the main reason that Stonewall was considered so important was just so quickly people started organizing on this. Let me see. Like 6 months later, they started a newspaper called Gay, because even the most liberal publications would not print the word gay in their advertisements, because
Right.
right after, like, everybody realized kind of that the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis were a little bit too kind of tame. There was like this new energy in the air, you know, there was an energy for like gay liberation. And so within 6 months, the Gay Liberation Front started, which was really the first organization at the time to use the word gay in like a national federation. And they tried to publish their call out for volunteers, for activists in the publication, the Village Voice, and they refused to print it. So they started a newspaper called Gay, and within 6 months, their readership went to 20,000 to 25,000 people. And and then Camney, who was one of the first participants, who had been a long-time organizer doing a lot of stuff with the Mattachine Society, said that by the time before Stonewall, basically, we had 50 to 60 gay groups in this country. A year later, there was at least 1,500. By 2 years later, to the extent that a count could be made, it was 2,500. So within 2 years after Stonewall, like, gay movement has just absolutely exploded. And the next year was really where where it became pretty obvious that the Stonewall riots were a real turning point, in that the first gay pride march happened, and it was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day on June 28th, 1970, the next year. And there were demonstrations in New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And in New York City, the marchers took up an entire 15 blocks, all the streets for 15 blocks.
That's thousands of people.
Thousands of people, absolutely massive march, and people really demanding to be seen and to be heard. And so it was in this context of like the networks that had been formed and the real turn to like people feeling empowered by this resistance and feeling like, wow, we really can take our bars back. We really can take all these streets back. So I think that's why Stonewall is still seen as such an important symbol. And I mean, even today, we carried a banner for Stonewall to remember.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Right, it was one of those just really critical turning points in history, where in the genesis of a movement, you can in any movement that you pick and do research on, you will find some certain turning points where things really changed. Sometimes it's not all for the better, but usually the ones we focus on are the ones that really made a positive, the positive possible.
And I think another a bunch of other stuff were the issues that people were talking about. So like obviously the police repression, but also the American Psychiatric Association from 1952 to 1973, being a homosexual was under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is their mental health manual, and it was considered a disorder, like a psychiatric disorder. And they, in 1971, they did a Zappin, the Gay Liberation Front did, which basically they were doing experiments, or at their conference, the APA was showing these experiments of electric shocks to like stop you from having same-sex attraction. And some Gay Liberation Front members like stood up and yelled like torture and barbarism, and were declaring this like torture of people's identities as it rightly was seen. And the next year, at the very next conference, they were invited to speak. And 1973, so 2 years after this and only 4 years after Stonewall, like being gay was dropped from the DSM.
The DSM, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember the researcher's name. She's very famous. I think it was in about 1959, knowing that that homosexuality was considered a psychiatric disorder. She did a really broad-based study of gay men and comparing their lifestyles and their general health and well-being and their family relationships, very broad-based, with hetero men, and found with these thousands and thousands of people, zero difference, absolutely none. And she published that, and so that really rattled the psychiatric community, but it didn't change things.
Yep, it was very early.
So another really interesting thing, just as a side note about Stonewall, the reason that the police did not call that night was because the family that owned Stonewall had not made some critical payments. There was, I think it was there was a number of Wall Street executives that were patrons of the bar. They were having trouble, setting them up, and there was some complexity, and there was Stonewall management, and the Genovese family, or I think is the family that owned the bar, but it was because that they hadn't made those very, very large payoffs to the police about these executives. That's why they didn't give forewarning, so they were punishing. All they were going to do is come in and humiliate the bar.
Yeah.
That was the intent by the cops. So, but just the fact that it was Wall Street executives and whatnot is, it adds another level of craziness to the history.
And those were mostly not the people fighting.
Right.
Most of the people were, a large part of Stonewall, besides the very wealthy executives, were some of the most marginalized in the city.
Right. I would almost be willing to bet there weren't a lot of executives that were throwing down in the streets with the cops. I'm making an assumption there, but that's not the kind of courage that I usually see.
Well, and it's definitely very well documented that a lot of the people who were really fighting that night were transgender women and homeless kids that had lived in the area for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Definitely, it's important to understand the history of a movement and to understand the oppression and repression that people are going through to see, and then after, a movement has gone on for several decades, to look back and kind of look at the origins and then to measure the success of today by. So at today's march, we took a bunch of photos, and I would like to put those on now, Jim, if you would, and Emily and I are just going to talk a little bit about today's march and what we saw and experienced there. So this, since I took the pictures, let me start us off here. We're down at the Hood plant, and people are just starting to arrive, and the floats are starting to get together. That's a beautiful 1925 Buick. I recognize that. That also is a float or a participant in the parade. Here is one of our esteemed members of Black Rose in his interesting buildup of a costume. Gotta love that. And so, guys, I was not able to attend them, but you had some art parties to get some banners made, Emily?
Yeah, we had 2 different art parties before, just to make the banners and have an open space. They were really fun.
So you came up with 3 banners. Here's Justice for Chelsea Manning. And there's the Stonewall was a riot banner. I got that several different ways. That's a great one. Again, the crowd assembling participants down in the parking lot of the Hood plant. And it was pretty cold out this morning. I think it was about 50 degrees compared to last year when I think it was in the 80s. You can see off last year's documentary that the young ladies did that people were, there was definitely a lot of bare-chested folks. But here's some brave people in the 50-degree weather. Here's a good friend with her lesbian versus capitalist patriarchy sandwich board, which I thought was particularly good. Again, just people assembling. It takes, about 300 marchers, don't you think? Something around there. So you got to have some space to fit everybody in. So now the parade has made it up to Church Street, and I think I got a shot of representing just about every single group that came by, so I don't want to leave anybody out. I love the little biker squad here.
Do we want to talk about why we organized Pride first?
Of course, yeah.
Or do we want to talk about that after the
We can do that. We can do that now too, as we watch the slides.
Okay. So what was significant for you, Brad, about the Queers Against Capitalism block in Pride?
Well, I'm obviously, if anybody has watched me, I am a very, very strong supporter of liberation for people in general and liberation movements in particular. I really don't feel personally that there are tremendous chopped up single issues. I think that all of these movements have common roots in basically, the way that our society is organized, which is very patriarchal, hierarchical, and very, very top down, and also very exploitive. So, as I mentioned before, I think that people fighting for their basic human rights is probably some of the most honorable things that humans in recent history have done and will do. So I think the political aspect is important to maintain as far as the demand to be recognized and to be seen and more as equals and to have equal rights with all others. So yeah, I mean, that's not really in a nutshell, but that's why I think it's critically important so we can grow a movement of movements moving into the future, because one movement is not going to fix things. We need to link all these movements. What about you, Emily? What do you think is most important?
Well, for me, I feel like the gay community and I have a fairly long and sometimes conflicted history, in that when I was 16, I came out after I started dating this girl Claire, and I was with her for 2 years, and it was certainly different. I can tell that we have been winning because 6 years ago when I came out, my mom was absolutely terrified when I went to the first political thing I did ever, which I went to the rally for gay marriage. Mm-hmm. And 2 weekends ago we were down, and my sister is getting married now, and we were at her bachelor party, and we ended up at a gay bar, which I realized in 2 minutes. They didn't realize until 20 minutes. I was like, y'all know this is a gay bar, right? And they're like, oh, that makes sense, awesome. And then my mom's just hanging out with these 2 gay guys who are getting married in New York in September.
So she's a little more tolerant now?
A little bit more tolerant, yeah. Which is great. So the world is definitely changing. And like I was saying, the first thing I ever did politically, I was 17. I'd been with my girlfriend for 2 years, and Massachusetts had just legalized gay marriage, and I think one other state, and now Vermont was thinking about legalizing gay marriage. Even though we were the first place to have civil rights.
Civil unions.
Civil
right?
unions,
Yep.
And now we wanted to change and make sure that the word marriage was really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember going and feeling fairly excluded in that I really had a lot of problems with marriage and still do, and feel it's still I feel we've changed really from the gay liberation front, which was saying we need universal health care for everybody. The queer struggle is the worker struggle, in that and some really radical demands of we demand people should be able to get their visitation rights based on who they want in the hospitals, and we think that all kinds of stuff, that people should be free from police repression, that people should be able to be seen on their own terms for an American Psychiatric Association, so that would include people with disabilities. It was really the gay struggle at the very beginning, when it changed to the gay liberation front, was very much liberation for all. We are part of an anti-capitalist struggle.
Right.
And there was still, before marriage, I think, was a right that gay people had, there was still a little bit more of that. But really this, centralization of marriage and the military. I would say the 3 big things, the gay movement, the LGBT, mainstream movement is fighting for, is like for federal recognition of marriage and Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, but for like full inclusion of LGBT people in the military and, for adoption. And like that has always put me in a fairly contentious place, as like a queer anti-capitalist. Like I think marriage has a long history of domination of women and really has divided movements and has like broken up extended families, and that's why like the nuclear family concept really came about during the capitalist revolution and really broke apart these long, extensive solidaristic bonds. And certainly like the military, like I don't want gay people to be in the military. I don't want the military to exist.
Right. There is internal built-in conflicts. When you're trying to assimilate into the broader society, you're trying to move into institutions whether they are justifiable or not.
Absolutely.
And industrial warfare, is insane at very best, is the best you could say about it.
Absolutely. And
but I get you.
And like they were saying in the Vermont Pride, is like this used to be a protest. Like gay pride used to be a protest and a protest over inequality. And
which is still really rampant if somebody wants to be honest. You
absolutely.
get out in the general population of just people that I know, and there's tremendous amounts of homophobia and blind hatred still amongst our fellow citizens.
Yeah, no, I'm still like always nervous to like tell people, like if I don't know somebody, and like less nervous in some situations, but like it's definitely like with authorities, it's very scary. Still.
You can get treated differently. I mean, it's
absolutely.
real.
And there's like definitely different laws, and like, me and Kate are always like, there's not a single gay bar in Burlington. Like we say that Burlington's so queer friendly, and there's like how many bars, and there's not a single gay bar, and like people are like, well, it's because people are very inclusive, and like you can
go to any bar.
You can go to any bar, and like that is true, like totally. Like I do think a lot of people feel really safe at bars, but also you see like things like pop-up queer dances or the underground bar hopping, which people organize, and it's because people still want the gay community. Like there's still a real need for it, and because I mean, even if like yes, people are included at like more heterosexual spaces, it's still not like our community and like where we grew up, and like our, it's just different, and it's really hard in that way. So for me, like bringing politics back to Pride was so important, in that like for me, the gay struggle, if it's not connected to a worker struggle, really just eliminates the vast majority of queers. Like I'm much less concerned about very wealthy white gay men being able to get married than I am about like homeless queer youth in the Castro getting kicked out when they've already been marginalized by their families. And it's like, who is gay liberation supposed to be for?
Right, and just being able to get food and just being able to get the basics things that you need to live.
Absolutely. And so that for me is like, it's, part of the longer class struggle, like who is this liberation for, and what is it about?
It is inspirational when, in certain senses, though, where people in other groups and other movements can really, it's like the civil rights movement and some of the other, and to some degree the environmental movement and the climate justice movement today. You've got to be able to congratulate yourself for the wins, too.
Absolutely.
And feeling good about,
And I also think that's one thing for me that I'm like really proud of the LGBT movement, is like it has always been an intensely confrontational movement. Like,
tell me what you mean.
Like when a lot of like pacifists will say that like no mass movement has ever been started with violent tactics, I just get to like throw out, I'm like, that's not true. Like the LGBT movement started in riots. Like the reason that the queer struggle has started is because people like really fought back like, physically, and we're like not gonna take crap.
Yeah.
And
you could say the civil rights movement true origins are in slave rebellions.
Absolutely.
In the 17 and 1800s.
Totally. And I mean, I think we're going to read this at the end, but I think there's truly like something revolutionary and very threatening about this idea of like being able to have sex with who you want and love who you want. And that's like a truly scary concept to the ruling class. And I think that's why they repressed so many people.
Well, it puts little peekaboo holes into the rigid structure that we're living in. If things start to shatter and fracture a little bit, that becomes something that, you know, that elite people are going to feel very nervous about.
Absolutely.
You don't ever want to, you know, let any light shine through those cracks. So.
Right, and I mean, I think you'll also hear the conservatives explicitly say, like, the whole point of sex is production and reproduction, right? Like, the reason, like, we're not afraid of gay people. Like, we don't care that they're gay. Like, that's fine, as long as they're not having sex, right? Or as long as sex is within marriage, because the point of sex for the conservative is procreation and production, which is such a capitalist mindset. Like, they can't imagine a world where people do things because they enjoy it and there's pleasure.
And they love each other.
And they love each other, right? There has to be some sort of production and some kind of capitalist mechanism.
Right.
Like, or else what's the point? So, like, from that framework, of course gay sex is, like, in their opinions, completely terrible because there's no productive capacity in it. It is all about, like, pleasure and desire and love and, you know, and especially, you know, a lot of the gay people, especially before the AIDS crisis, were not, you know, only having these very monogamous, you know, lives, and they were really building bonds of solidarity with huge amounts of people and, like, their lovers and their ex-lovers, and people were treated very much as, like, comrades in struggle.
Yeah. I mean, in the media, they always used to claim all the promiscuity and just the rampant, you know, running from partner to partner to partner to partner. You know, most of that I always dismissed as propaganda.
No, and I don't think there was, like, running from partner. I think there was a lot of, like, people building really long-term bonds.
Like heterosexual people do in dating and seeing and meeting each other. I don't see much of a difference.
Absolutely, but without that expectation that someday you would bond your relationship to the state.
Right. Exactly. It's revolutionary at its core.
Yeah. And so I think, like, for me, like, coming to Pride was really important to, like, because, like, I don't want the reason that queer people can get health care is because of marriage. I think all of us deserve health care, you know, like, and so I think it is an important struggle to take up. And of course, I support the right for queer people to have marriage because that is, like, a really important compromise. But at the end of the day, I think everybody should have health care. And that's why, you know, like, the Workers' Center also marched with the universal health care. I think that, like, housing, same thing. A lot of, you know, gay people are saying, well, we need marriage so we can get housing benefits. And it's like, okay, well, let's fight for housing for all.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And, like, if the gay community truly took up these struggles for universal housing, for universal health care, for universal education and food, I bet you a lot of, like, the homophobic parts of the working class would change on a dime.
Right.
They'd
with
be
some
like,
victories
okay,
in
like,
those areas.
You know, if they truly took up a working class struggle, and it would be, you know,
which is just taking the next logical step.
Absolutely.
It's a logical progression of identifying issues, identifying the problems, and then taking the meaningful steps that will change things from the bottom, the structural things that needed to be changed.
And, like, I remember being so excited 2 years ago when the largest LGBT organizations partnered with the largest African American organizations to fight for the same, you know, at both that year they were voting on the Voter Segregation Act.
Oh, wasn't there a repeal?
Yeah, they were trying to repeal basically what the civil rights had won for voting, and they were trying to, like, keep DOMA, you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So both the largest LGBT organizations and the largest African American organizations partnered to fight for both and fight on both agendas, seeing that their struggles were linked. And, like, even though these communities for a long time had been seen as very separate and having very different perspectives. And so I think we really need to take on each other's struggles.
And talking about a logical progression, like I was saying too, there aren't any single movements. You're saying it much more eloquently than I described it. But these, if we are not able to blend these movements into a political force, then we're going to be condemned to what we've been going through for many, many decades, which is being led around like kids by a bunch of people that really mostly care about themselves. So it's important to take those next logical steps.
Definitely.
So I am going to, this is a pamphlet that was put together by the Black Rose Anarchist Federation, Black Rose Burlington. To get involved with the struggle, email us at BRRN, Black Rose Rosa Negra Burlington at gmail.com. Like Black Rose on Facebook, and on this festive day, supported with advertisements from our local capitalists and wage slavers, smiled on by the Chamber of Commerce and creating tax revenue for the city government to buy more attack dogs and pepper balls for unruly protesters, let us take a moment to remember exactly what we have pride about. 45 years on from Stonewall, queers have thrown ourselves through the glass ceiling the same way we threw bricks through windows that fateful day in New York. We have openly gay politicians, we have gay marriage statutes in many states. We have managed to convince society at large that we're not freaks, not wild-eyed destroyers of Christian morality, but normal people who just want to love and be loved. But is that even true? Did we fight for nothing better or higher than to integrate ourselves into the straitjacket of monogamous state-sanctioned marriage, to contribute millions of dollars to the wedding industry, to gentrify the Castro district and force homeless queer youth living in the park because their parents still won't accept them, to be kicked awake by the police and shuffled to the outskirts of town? Is the same system that tortures and imprisons Chelsea Manning for revealing its war crimes in Iraq, let alone denying her the medical care she needs, the system into which we fought to integrate? Or is there, perhaps, something actually threatening to the ruling order about a liberated and diverse sexual culture? The right to love who and how you want, to have sex when and how you want to have it, does not just apply to queers. Radical queerness carries in its wake free abortion on demand, safety from street harassment and rape, an end to the hazing socialization of masculinity, and respect and care for single teen mothers and the future generations that they raise. Threats to traditional gender roles are threats to hate criminals and war criminals, to religious fascists and rape culture. If we try to ignore this, avoiding a class analysis and participation in class war, queer liberation will be mostly for white, wealthy queers able to insulate themselves from the bullying of their parents and peers and legislators. As queer anarchists, we know that as long as there is government and wage slavery, instead of free and voluntary association, there will be people with the right and ability to beat, torture, imprison, starve, evict, and kill the rest of us. And the rest of us inevitably means the most despised and marginal peoples with the fewest allies and resources for self-defense. So today, as we celebrate Pride, let us continue to strive to give ourselves something of which to be proud. Let's remember that no one is free when anyone is unfree. Viva la revolución. So I also wanted to plug a couple of events. Join us this Thursday, September 18th at 7 o'clock at RU12, 255 South Champlain Street, number 12 in Burlington. We will be showing the film How to Survive a Plague, a film about how radical queers fought for treatment and survival during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And lest we forget, Luke O'Donovan is a gay man sentenced to several years in prison in Georgia for defending himself against a homophobic attack, and he needs all of our support. Please go to Let Luke Go at wordpress.com. So you said you gave out about 500 of these pamphlets today.
I did give out about 500 of those
That's
pamphlets.
pretty successful. That's a lot of minds reading.
Yeah, people were really excited, actually.
Cool. Good. You already had some feedback?
Yeah, I mean, people that we know, but
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
a lot of people were like totally waiting.
Yeah, right
and,
on.
saw all our banners and seemed pretty excited by it.
I know. That's the energy I felt too. So it really, I mean, it is and was an amazing event. And I certainly, you know, as a marketer and a business person myself, I see the desire by businesses and mainstream political parties and whatnot to participate. But it's also important to remember that people make up all of those organizations too, and everybody has their own mind and their own opinions. And it's come, seeing the change like from the 60s, 70s, and 80s until now. In its own way, it's kind of amazing to see all that commercial interest in a gay pride march.
Absolutely.
That also is a win, in some ways that you look at it. So, well, thanks, Emily, for coming on. I really appreciate that. Remember, the Black Rose Anarchist Federation. Remember to like us on Facebook, and we are brrnburlington@gmail.com. So feel free to email us with anything that you would want to talk about, or at least leave a message about. So, and join us. When are our meetings again?
We have meetings like every other Thursday. And then, we have events like Pride, and this week we're having the video.
So there'll be, even at the People's Climate March and the big climate conferencing in New York City is this weekend. I'm sure there will be very large gay contingents and participants. There will be at least also, alternative political theorizing folks. There will be anarchists. There will be people from all over the spectrum coming together to try to, at least shout some common sense at the powers that be. So,
Are you going to do a show about it next time?
Yeah, so our next show, we are going to try to do some roving interviews as we march in New York City. Hopefully there will be hundreds of thousands of people, but Arthur and I are getting together a plan to actually try to do some interviews as we march and get some good footage and just try to capture the energy and what's happening. I wish I could be there on Monday with the Flood Wall Street thing. That's really going to be something else.
Yeah, for sure.
So people are wearing blue, I guess, and they are going to attempt to flood Wall Street with their bodies, which is going to be something that the New York Police Department is not really going to want to have happen. So that'll be interesting. The conference.
Please choose a sponsored video. Your content.
Whoops, I think that was something that we didn't intend to happen. But this whole UN conferencing and whatnot has been really taken over by a lot of corporate interests. There's a lot of false solutions out there. They're trying desperately to figure out ways to make money off of the climate justice movement. Yes. So a lot of that stuff has to be counteracted by like-minded people. So are you going to be able to go down?
I am going to New York, yes.
Good. You are going to be a street medic, aren't you?
I am, yep. I am
Awesome.
organizing the medical infrastructure, which hopefully means I hand out Band-Aids and water.
Right, and nothing more serious than that.
Yeah, but EMS actually has a really difficult time in demonstrations because the way that EMS is set up, the way that EMS is set up is that you have to call 911. I say this as somebody who is in EMS.
Right.
We have to set it up so that police take command before medical takes command, which is why Katrina was such an absolute disaster, is because the police are supposed to stabilize the situation,
and they did
but
not.
They're out, firing on communities of color and making sure they don't have
guarding wealthy neighborhoods
and guarding the wealthy white neighborhoods,
which is certainly what they did.
Which is certainly what happened, and so that's where the street medic movement comes in, and we'll also be in New York because sometimes the police do not like unstable situations.
So we'll see everybody in New York. This is the Black Rose edition of Critical Mass TV. Let's say goodbye, Emily. Say goodbye to the fans.